By the time the killing stopped, 17 men were dead. No arrests were made. No trials were held. No witnesses came forward. The mine shaft that collapsed that spring took 6 lives an instant, but what followed in the months after would claim nearly 3 times that number. This is not a story about mining accidents. This is a story about what happens when grief turns to rage, when economic desperation meets ancestral hatred, and when a community decides that justice will not come from courtrooms but from the barrel of a gun. It started with rock and timber, giving way 300 feet below the surface. It ended with bodies laid out in the dirt under an October sky, blood soaking into the same earth that had swallowed their fathers and grandfathers before them. What happened in Black Hollow that year was not random violence. It was systematic. It was planned. And everyone who lived through it carried the weight of what they saw, or what they did, or what they chose not to see for the rest of their lives. This was a place where disputes were not small, even when they started that way. A place where the law was a distant concept, something that existed in county seats and state capitals, but rarely made its way down the unpaved roads that wound through mountains. Black Hollow was not on any map that mattered. It was a name spoken in low voices, a place people left if they could, and a place people stayed if they had no choice. The mine was everything. It was employment, identity, survival. When the mine was working, families ate. When it was not, they starved. And when it collapsed, it did not just take lives. It took the fragile balance that kept blood feuds from becoming massacres. The mountains here were old, worn down by time and weather into dark ridges covered in oak and pine. The hollow itself was a narrow valley carved by a creek that ran brown with runoff from the mines, a thin ribbon of poisoned water that no one drank from and nothing grew beside. Houses were scattered along the creek bed and up the hillsides, wooden structures that leaned with age, their roofs patched with tin and tar paper, their porches sagging under the weight of years. Smoke rose from chimneys even in summer, because the damp never fully left, and the cold lived in the bones of the place even when the sun was high. There were no street lights, no telephones in most homes, no doctors closer than 15 miles, and that road was impassable half the year. The mine company owned the land, the houses, the store where families bought their food on credit against future wages. It was a system designed to keep men working, to keep them trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency that passed from father to son like a family name. The company did not care about safety. It cared about coal, and coal came from men willing to go into the earth and bring it back, no matter the cost. The people who lived in Black Hollow were not outsiders. They were generations deep, families that had been in these mountains since before the Civil War, who had fought in that war and come back to find their land taken, their timber cut, their creeks dammed. They had learned to survive on what the mountains gave them and what the mines paid them, and they had learned not to trust anyone who was not kin. Blood mattered here. Family mattered. And insults, slights, betrayals, these things were remembered. They were kept in the ledger of memory and passed down like heirlooms. Feuds were not uncommon. They were part of the landscape, as natural as the ridges and hollows. Most were old, rooted in disputes over land or women or livestock, things that happened so long ago that no one could quite remember how they started, only that they had never ended. But they were managed. There were unspoken rules. You did not kill a man in front of his children. You did not burn a house with people inside. You settled things quietly, and you kept the law out of it, because the law only made things worse. For the most part, the system worked. Violence was rare, and when it happened, it was personal, contained. But the collapse changed everything. The mine shaft that caved in was called Number 4. It was one of the deeper tunnels, following a seam of coal that angled down into a mountain at a steep pitch. The timbers holding up the ceiling were old, many of them rotting, and the company had ignored warnings from the miners about strange sounds in rock, about water seeping through cracks, about sections of roof that sagged visibly under their own weight. On April 19th, at just past 9 in the morning, the ceiling came down. It happened without warning, a sudden roar that shook the ground above, followed by a silence that felt unnatural. 6 men were inside that section. When it collapsed, none of them made it out. The bodies were not recovered for 3 days. When they were finally brought to the surface, they were unrecognizable crushed by the weight of the mountain. Families gathered at the mouth of the tunnel, women in dark dresses standing in the mud, men with their hats in their hands, children silent and wide-eyed. The mine company offered no compensation. It offered no explanation. It simply posted a notice that the tunnel was closed and that work would resume in the remaining sections the following Monday. That was when the first cracks appeared, not in the rock, but in the social structure that had kept the hollow from tearing itself apart. Of the 6 men who died, 4 were from the Harlan family. 2 were from the Caudles. These were not random names. These were the 2 largest clans in Black Hollow, families that had coexisted uneasily for generations, families that had old grievances buried like corpses in shallow graves, always just beneath the surface. The Harlans controlled most of the work in the mine. They had connections with the company, men who spoke for them, who made sure their kin got the safer jobs, the better shifts. The Caudles did not have that. They worked the dangerous sections, the deep tunnels, the places where cave-ins were common and men disappeared. And now, for Harlans were dead, crushed in a tunnel that the Caudles had warned was unsafe. It did not take long for accusations to spread. The Caudles, people said, had known the tunnel was going to collapse. They had seen the signs, heard the warnings, and they had said nothing. They had let the Harlans go into that tunnel, knowing it was a death trap. Some went further. They said the Caudles had sabotaged the supports, weakened the timbers, ensured that when the roof came down, it would take Harlan lives with it. There was no evidence for this. There were only whispers, rumors passed in low voices, the kind of talk that grows in the absence of truth and takes on a life of its own. The Caudles denied everything. They said they had warned the company, that they had told the foreman the tunnel was unsafe, and that they had been ignored. They pointed out that 2 of their own had died in the collapse, that they had lost kin just like the Harlans. But grief does not listen to reason. Grief needs a target, and the Harlans had found theirs. The funeral for the 4 dead men was held on a gray Sunday, rain falling in steady sheets, turning the cemetery into a swamp. The Caudles did not attend. They were not welcome, and that absence, that refusal to mourn together, was the moment when the violence became inevitable. It started small. A Caudle barn burned down one night in early May. No one saw who did it, but everyone knew. A week later, a Harlan boy was beaten on the road home from a mine, his face left unrecognizable, his ribs cracked. He could not say who had attacked him, but he did not need to. The pattern was clear. This was not going to end with words. This was not going to end with apologies. This was going to end with blood. The first killing happened on a Thursday in late May. A Harlan man named Clayton was walking home from the company's store when he was shot from the trees. The bullet caught him in the chest, and he was dead before he hit the ground. No one heard the shot. No one saw the shooter. But Clayton's body was found an hour later, lying in the road, his groceries scattered around him. The message was clear. The Caudles were not hiding anymore. They were hunting. The Harlans responded 3 days later. A Caudle man named Jesse was found in the creek, his throat cut, his body weighted down with rocks. He had been missing for 2 days, and when they pulled him from the water, his skin was gray, his eyes open and staring. The sheriff came out from the county seat, asked a few questions, took a few notes, and left. He did not arrest anyone. He did not investigate. He knew better. This was not his jurisdiction. Not really. This was something older, something beyond the reach of law. By June, the killing had taken on a rhythm. Every few days, another body. Sometimes a Harlan, sometimes a Caudle. Sometimes the death was quick, a bullet from ambush. Sometimes it was slow, a man found beaten and left to die in the woods. The mine kept running, because the mine always kept running, but men stopped walking alone. They carried guns openly now, rifles slung over their shoulders, pistols tucked into belts. Women did not leave their houses after dark. Children were kept inside. The hollow became a place of silence and suspicion, where every stranger was a potential killer and every shadow hid a threat. The mine company did nothing. It issued no statements, made no appeals for calm. It simply continued to extract coal, to load it onto trains, to ship it out to cities where people burned in their furnaces, and never thought about where it came from or what it cost. The company did not care if miners killed each other. There were always more miners. There were always more men desperate enough to go underground, to risk their lives for wages that barely kept their families fed. The dead were replaced within days, new men brought in from other hollows, men who did not know the history and did not care, who only wanted work. But the families cared. The families remembered. And the families were not going to stop until every slight, every death, every betrayal had been answered. This was no longer about the mine collapse. This was about decades of resentment, generations of slights and insults and perceived injustices that had been buried under the surface and were now erupting like poison from a wound. The collapse had been the spark, but the fuel had been there all along, dry and waiting. In July, something happened that made peace impossible. A Harlan woman named Sarah was walking to her sister's house when she was caught in the crossfire of an ambush meant for her husband. She was 32 years old. She had 3 children. She was not part of the feud. She was not involved. And she died in the road, shot twice, her blood pooling in the dirt while her children screamed from the porch. After that, there was no going back. After that, the killing was no longer targeted. It was total. The Harlans organized. They gathered every man of fighting age, every cousin and uncle and brother-in-law, and they made a plan. They were not going to wait for the Caudles to strike first. They were not going to play defense. They were going to end this, once and for all. They spent weeks preparing, stockpiling ammunition, scouting Caudle houses, learning routines and movements. They did not talk about it openly, but everyone knew. The entire hollow knew, and the Caudles knew too. They made their own preparations, their own plans. Both sides were arming for war, and the only question was who would move first. The answer came on the night of October 7th. The Harlans struck just after midnight, moving through the darkness in groups of 3 and 4, each group assigned a target. They hit 5 Caudle houses simultaneously, kicking in doors, dragging men from their beds, shooting them in front of their families. They did not hesitate. They did not negotiate. They simply executed. By the time the sun rose, 7 Caudle men were dead. Their bodies were left where they fell, in doorways and yards, in bedrooms and kitchens. The Harlans did not hide what they had done. They wanted everyone to know. The Caudles responded the next night. They did not attack houses. They attacked the mine itself. A group of Caudle men, maybe 8 or 10, waited near the entrance to number 2 shaft, hidden in the trees. When the night shift ended and the miners began to emerge, tired and covered in cold dust, the Caudles opened fire. They shot indiscriminately, not caring who they hit, only that they were Harlans or Harlan allies. 6 men died in that first volley. 3 more were wounded and died before help could arrive. The bodies were left in the mud outside the mine entrance, the company floodlights casting harsh shadows over the scene. The massacre at the mine broke something fundamental. This was no longer a feud. This was a slaughter. The Harlans regrouped, gathered every man they could, and decided to finish it. They were not going to wait for another attack. They were going to wipe the Caudles out entirely. Every man who could hold a gun, every boy old enough to carry a grudge. They were going to make sure that when this was over, there would be no one left to seek revenge. On October 14th, the Harlans moved. They came in the early morning, just before dawn, when the light was gray and uncertain. They surrounded the cluster of Caudle houses near the upper end of the hollow, cutting off escape routes, positioning shooters on the hillsides with clear lines of sight. And then they attacked. The gunfire was constant, a roar that echoed off the ridges and could be heard miles away. Windows shattered, walls splintered. Men ran into the open and were cut down. Some tried to surrender. They were shot anyway. Some tried to hide. They were dragged out and killed in the yard. The massacre lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 11 Caudle men were dead. 2 more died from their wounds in the days that followed. The Harlan losses were minimal. 2 men wounded, neither seriously. The bodies were left where they fell. It was 3 days before anyone dared to move them. 3 days in which they lay in the October sun, bloating and rotting, a message written in flesh and bone that everyone in Black Hollow could read. By the time authorities arrived, it was already over. The sheriff came with a deputy. looked at the scene, took a few statements from people who claimed they had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. He did not arrest anyone. He did not even try. He filed a report, marked the case as unsolved, and left. The state police were notified but did not respond. The newspapers ran a brief story buried on page 6, a few paragraphs about a mining dispute that had turned violent. No names were mentioned. No investigation was launched. Black Hollow was left to bury its dead and live with what it had done. The mine kept running. Coal kept being extracted. The company's store stayed open. Life, in its strange way, continued. But it was not the same. The hollow was quieter now, the silence heavy and oppressive. Families that had lived there for generations began to leave, packing what they could carry and walking out, never to return. Those who stayed did not speak of what had happened. They did not tell their children the full story. They buried the memory as deeply as they buried the bodies, in unmarked graves scattered through the woods, in places only they knew. The caudals were broken. Of the men who survived, most fled, moving to other states, changing their names, trying to forget. A few stayed, too old or too poor to leave, living in the ruins of their homes, ghosts among ghosts. The Harlans remained in control of the hollow, but it was a hollow victory. They had won, but they had lost everything in the process. Brothers, fathers, sons, all dead. The mine that had been the center of their world was closing. The coal seemed played out, the company moving on to richer fields. Within 5 years, Black Hollow was abandoned. The houses left to rot. The mine entrances sealed with concrete and steel. Today, if you go there, you will find nothing but ruins. Collapsed roofs, broken windows, foundations slowly being swallowed by the forest. The creek still runs brown, still poisoned by a century of mining. The cemetery is overgrown, the headstones tilted and illegible. There is no memorial, no marker to explain what happened here. The official records say nothing. The newspapers say nothing. The only people who remember are the descendants of those who survived, and they do not talk about it. They carry the weight of Black Hollow in silence, a shame passed down through generations, a secret too terrible to speak. No one was ever officially charged. No trials were held. No one went to prison. The collapse of Number 4 shaft in April 1927 killed 6 men, but the violence that followed killed 17 more. And in the end, justice was not done. It was avoided, buried, forgotten. The law did not come to Black Hollow. The law never came. And everyone who lived there, everyone who saw what happened or chose not to see, knew exactly what that meant. They knew who pulled the triggers. They knew who planned the attacks. They knew who was responsible. But knowing and speaking are two different things, and in Black Hollow, silence was the only language left. The winter after the massacre was the coldest anyone could remember. Snow came early and stayed late, burying Black Hollow under drifts that made the roads impassable for months. The living were trapped with their dead, with their memories, with the knowledge of what they had done or failed to prevent. Smoke rose from chimneys and thin gray columns, the only sign that people still lived in those leaning houses. But they were not living, not really. They were surviving. They were waiting for something to happen, for justice to arrive, for God to strike them down or forgive them. But nothing came. The snow fell. The days passed, and the silence grew deeper. The children who had witnessed the killing stopped speaking. Not all of them, but enough that it became noticeable. They would sit at the table during meals, eyes fixed on their plates, eating mechanically, saying nothing. They stopped playing. They stopped laughing. They moved through the world like small ghosts, traumatized into a silence that mirrored their parents' silence. The adults did not know how to help them. How do you explain to a child that the world they thought was safe had never been safe at all? How do you tell them that the men who killed their neighbors might be their own uncles, their own fathers? So they said nothing. They let the children carry their trauma alone, hoping that time would heal what words could not. There were suicides in the months that followed. 3 men, all Harlans, all participants in the October 14th massacre. The first hanged himself in his barn on a December morning. His wife found him when she went to feed the livestock. She did not scream. She simply cut him down, dragged his body into the house, and sent her son to fetch the undertaker. At the funeral, No one asked why he had done it. Everyone knew. The weight of what he'd seen, what he'd done, had become unbearable. The other two followed within weeks. One walked into the frozen creek and did not come out. The other put a shotgun in his mouth. Their deaths were recorded as accidents, as natural causes, as anything but what they were, because to acknowledge them as suicides would be to acknowledge the guilt, and guilt was something Black Hollow could not afford to admit. The Harlan women became the keepers of the story, not in words, but in rituals. They would gather on certain dates, anniversaries of the killings, and sit together in silence. They would cook meals and leave them on doorsteps of families who had lost someone, even coddle families, though they never spoke when they did this. They would tend graves in the cemetery, pulling weeds, straightening stones, leaving wildflowers picked from hillsides. These acts were not forgiveness. They were not even apology. They were acknowledgement. They were the only language the women had left to say what could not be said aloud. We know what was done. We carry it with us. We will remember. But memory is a complicated thing. As the years passed, the story began to change. Not deliberately, not through conscious lies, but through the natural erosion of truth that happens when people cannot bear to remember things as they actually were. The massacre became a fight, then a skirmish, then just some trouble between families. The 17 dead became fewer in the telling, then fewer still. The brutality was softened. The executions reframed as self-defense. The killing of men who tried to surrender edited out of the narrative entirely. By the time children born after massacre were old enough to ask questions, the story they were told bore only a faint resemblance to what had actually happened. This revisionism was not universal. There were those who refused to let the truth be buried. Old women who would grab their grandchildren by the wrists and say, in low, fierce voices, "I'm going to tell you what really happened, and you're going to remember." They would describe the killings in detail, leaving nothing out, forcing the next generation to carry the weight they had carried. These truth-tellers were often ostracized, called bitter, called crazy, called liars. But they persisted. They understood that if the truth died with them, if it was allowed to fade into comfortable myth, then the dead would be betrayed twice, once when they were killed, and again when they were forgotten. The economy of Black Hollow collapsed in the 1930s. The mine closed completely. The coal seemed exhausted, the company having extracted everything of value and moved on. Without the mine, there was no work. Without work, there was no reason to stay. Families began to leave, loading what they could onto wagons and trucks, abandoning houses they had lived in for generations. Some went north to factory towns, others west to try farming on cheaper land. They scattered like seeds, spreading across the country, carrying Black Hollow with them in ways they did not fully understand. Those who left rarely spoke of where they came from. When asked, they would name the county or the state, but not the Hollow. They would change the subject, deflect, make it clear that this was not a topic open for discussion. Their children grew up knowing their parents came from somewhere in the mountains, but not knowing where exactly or why they never went back. They grew up sensing a weight their parents carried, but not understanding its source. The trauma was passed down, unnamed and unexplained, manifesting in anxiety, in distrust of authority, in a bone-deep fear of conflict that made them avoid confrontation at all costs. The Hollow itself began to die. Houses that were abandoned were quickly claimed by weather and time. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow. Windows shattered in storms. Walls fell in on themselves. The forest moved back in, reclaiming what had been taken from it. Within a decade, Black Hollow looked like it had been abandoned for a century. The creek still ran brown, poisoned by decades of mining runoff, and nothing lived in it. The mine entrances were sealed with concrete barriers and chain-link fences, warning signs posted about the dangers of unstable ground and toxic air. The company wanted no liability, no lawsuits from curious trespassers who might get hurt exploring the tunnels. So they erased the mine, made it inaccessible, as if by sealing the entrances they could seal away what had happened there. In 1938, a journalist from a regional paper heard rumors about Black Hollow and decided to investigate. He spent weeks in the area, talking to people in surrounding towns, trying to piece together what had happened. Most people refused to talk to him. Those who did spoke in vague terms, saying there had been some violence, some deaths, but nothing more specific than that. He managed to track down a few families who had lived in the hollow, but when he knocked on their doors and identified himself as a reporter, they would not let him in. One man, a Harlan who had left in 32, agreed to speak on the condition of anonymity. He described the massacre in detail, naming names, describing the planning and execution. The journalist took notes, prepared to write the story. But when he submitted it to his editor, it was killed. The editor told him it was too inflammatory, too likely to stir up old hatreds, too dangerous. The journalist argued. The editor refused. The story was never published. The journalist kept his notes, filed them away, and moved on to other assignments. Those notes, if they still exist, are buried in some archive, unread and unknown. The Second World War pulled many of the younger men from the area, including sons and grandsons of those involved in the massacre. Some of them never came back, killed in Europe or the Pacific. Others returned changed, having seen violence on a scale that made Black Hollow seem small, almost quaint. They did not talk about the war, and they did not talk about the Hollow. They found jobs, started families, tried to build normal lives. But the war had a strange effect on their understanding of what had happened in 1927. In the context of mass slaughter, of industrialized killing, the massacre seemed almost personal, almost intimate. 17 men killed over the course of months seemed like nothing compared to thousands killed in a single day. This perspective did not bring comfort. If anything, it made things worse, because it meant that human beings were capable of even greater horrors than what had happened in Black Hollow, and that the capacity for such violence was not an aberration but a constant, something that lived just beneath the surface of civilization, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. In the 1950s, the interstate highway system began to reshape America, and the mountains that had once isolated places like Black Hollow became less formidable. Roads were paved, bridges were built, tunnels were carved through ridges. The Hollow was no longer as remote as it had once been. This accessibility brought new people, outsiders who did not know the history and did not care. They came to hunt, to fish in cleaner streams farther up the mountain, to camp in the national forest that had been established nearby. Some of them stumbled across the ruins of Black Hollow. They found it picturesque in a melancholy way. The collapsed houses and rusted machinery giving the place an air of romantic decay. They took photographs. They posted them in travel magazines with captions about forgotten Americana and the dying coal industry. They had no idea what they were looking at. They saw ruins. They did not see graves. By the 1960s, most of the people who had lived through the massacre were dead. The last few survivors were very old, their memories fragmented, their willingness to speak diminished by age and isolation. A graduate student in anthropology, working on a thesis about Appalachian culture, managed to interview two of them in 1964. Both were women, widows of men who had been killed. They spoke carefully, choosing their words, leaving out more than they included. But even in their careful speech, the horror came through. The student recorded the interviews on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. She transcribed them, included excerpts in her thesis. The thesis was submitted, approved, and filed away in a university library. It has been checked out 3 times in the 60 years since. The tapes themselves were lost at some point, misplaced during a departmental move, or discarded when the technology became obsolete. The environmental movement of the 70s brought attention to the damage done by mining, and Black Hollow became a case study in ecological destruction. Scientists came to test the water in the creek, to measure the toxicity of the soil, to document the absence of plant and animal life. They published papers in academic journals with titles like Long-Term Environmental Impact of Abandoned Coal Mines in Central Appalachia. The papers were thorough, well-researched, full of data and graphs. They mentioned, in passing, that the area had been abandoned in the 1930s. They did not mention why. The scientists saw an environmental disaster. They did not see a human one. In 1987, a group of descendants of the Caudill family, scattered across several states, organized a reunion. It was the first time in over 50 years that members of the family had gathered intentionally. They met in a park in Tennessee, neutral ground away from the mountains. There were perhaps 30 people there, ranging from elderly survivors to children who had never heard the name Black Hollow. The older generation told stories. carefully edited versions that emphasized resilience and survival. They did not talk about the massacre. But late in the evening, after the food had been eaten and the children had gone to play, one of the old women began to speak. She was 89 years old, the daughter of one of the men killed on October 14th. She described what she had seen. She named the men who had done it. She spoke for over an hour, her voice steady, her memory precise. When she finished, no one said anything. They sat in silence as the sun set and the park lights came on. Then they gathered their things and left. They have not had a reunion since. The collapse of the coal industry in the 80s and 90s brought economic devastation to the region, but Black Hollow was already long dead. The new poverty, the loss of jobs, the opioid crisis that followed, these were tragedies that affected living communities. Black Hollow was a ghost, irrelevant to contemporary suffering. But there were echoes. The same patterns: corporate exploitation, institutional neglect, communities left to fend for themselves, violence born of desperation and rage. The same failures of law and justice. The same silence. History did not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymed. In 2009, a hiker exploring the area with a GPS unit and a metal detector found something in the woods near the ruins of Black Hollow. It was a mass of rusted metal that turned out to be firearms, dozens of them, hidden under a rock overhang and covered with decades of leaves and soil. Rifles, shotguns, pistols, all corroded beyond use. He reported the find to local authorities, thinking it might be significant. A deputy came out, looked at the guns, and said they were probably left over from hunting camps or moonshiners. The hiker suggested they might be connected to the violence that had occurred in the area in the 1920s. The deputy said he did not know anything about that. The guns were photographed, cataloged, and taken to a county storage facility. They are still there, rusting in a cardboard box, evidence of something no one wants to investigate. The internet age brought new possibilities for research, and in the 2010s, amateur historians began to piece together fragments of the Black Hollow story using digitized newspaper archives, census records, death certificates. They created websites and blog posts, trying to reconstruct what had happened. But they ran into the same obstacles everyone else had encountered: missing records, conflicting accounts, living descendants who refused to speak. One researcher managed to identify most of the victims and create a list with names and dates of death. She posted it online. Within a week, she received an anonymous email telling her to take it down. She did. She did not say why, but she stopped researching Black Hollow entirely. The youngest person alive who has any direct memory of Black Hollow is 97 years old. She was 5 when her family left in 1933. She remembers the house they lived in, the smell of coal smoke, the sound of her mother crying at night. She remembers men with guns, though she does not remember why they had them. She remembers the long walk out, carrying a bundle of clothes, her father silent and grim. She has told this story to her children and grandchildren, but she does not think they really understand. To them, it is ancient history, something that happened in a different world. To her, it is yesterday. She can still see the hollow in her mind, still feel the cold, still hear her mother's tears. There is no marker for Black Hollow, no historical plaque, no monument. The name does not appear on modern maps. The state government has no record of it ever existing. The county has a file, but it is marked restricted, and no one will say why. The descendants who know the full story are dying, and they are not passing it on. The truth is fading. In another generation, maybe 2, there will be no one left who remembers. Black Hollow will become a rumor, a ghost story, something that might have happened but probably did not. The 17 dead will be forgotten completely. Their names will disappear, and the place that killed them will swallow the memory of their deaths just as it swallowed their bodies. Completely, finally, without trace. But the land remembers. The earth that absorbed their blood remembers. The trees that grew from soil enriched by their decomposition remember. The water that runs brown to the creek, poisoned by a century of extraction, remembers. The mountains themselves, ancient and patient, remember. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the land does not need human witnesses to keep its accounts. Perhaps the hollow itself is a memorial, and the silence that covers it is not erasure but preservation, a way of holding something too terrible to speak, but too important to forget. This is what remains of Black Hollow, a valley in the mountains where nothing grows and no one lives, a place named that exists only in the memories of the very old, a story that was deliberately buried and accidentally preserved, passed down in whispers and fragments, never fully told and never fully forgotten. It is a wound in the landscape, in the history of a region, in the lineage of families who carry its legacy whether they know it or not. And it is a reminder that justice delayed is not justice at all, that silence is not peace, and that some crimes are so absolute that they can never be reconciled, only remembered. There's a photograph. Only one. It sits in a drawer in a house 3 states away from where Black Hollow used to be. The woman who owns it is 78 years old, the granddaughter of a man who was there, who saw what happened, who never spoke of it except once, on his deathbed, when a morphine loosened his tongue and the words came pouring out like poison from a wound. She inherited the photograph when he died, found it tucked inside a Bible that had not been opened in decades, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had rotted to fragments. The photograph is small, faded, the kind taken with a cheap camera in the 1920s. It shows a group of men standing in front of a mine entrance, their faces dark with cold dust, their eyes squinting against the sun. 13 men. Some of them are smiling. Most are not. On the back, in pencil that has faded to almost nothing, someone wrote a date, April 1927. And below that, a single word before, she has never shown this photograph to anyone. She has never tried to identify the men in it, though she suspects that several of them are among the 17 dead. She keeps it hidden because she understands that it is not just a photograph. It is evidence. It is proof that these men existed, that they stood together in the sunlight, that they were real people with faces and names before they became statistics, before they became ghosts, before they were erased from history. And she knows that there are people, even now, who would prefer that evidence did not exist. Sometimes she takes the photograph out and looks at it. She studies the faces, tries to imagine who they were, what they hoped for, whether they knew what was coming. She wonders if the man on the left, the tall one with a serious expression, was a Harlan or a Caudle. She wonders if the younger man on the right, barely more than a boy, made out alive, or if his body was left to rot in the October sun. She wonders if anyone mourned them properly, if anyone said their names, if anyone told their children the truth about how they died and why. She has thought about donating the photograph to a historical society, to a museum, to someone who might be able to identify the men and give them back their names. But she has not done it. She is afraid. Not of violence. Not anymore. The people who committed the massacre are all dead. Their children are dead. Even most of their grandchildren are gone. But she is afraid of what it would mean to break the silence, to be the one who dragged Black Hollow back into the light. She is afraid of the phone calls, the accusations, the relatives who would say she betrayed the family, who would say some things are meant to stay buried. So the photograph stays in the drawer, and the men in it remain nameless. In the end, this is what Black Hollow leave behind: a poison creek that runs through an empty valley, foundations of houses disappearing under moss and leaves, a cemetery where most of the stones have fallen, and the names have worn away, a handful of descendants scattered across the country, carrying trauma they cannot name and do not fully understand. A photograph in a drawer, rumors, whispers, fragments of stories that do not quite cohere into truth, and silence, always silence. The silence of institutions that chose not to investigate, the silence of newspapers that chose not to publish, the silence of families that chose not to speak, the silence of community that decided, collectively and without ever discussing it, that forgetting was safer than remembering. That silence is weight. It is mass. It presses down on the hollow like the mountain pressed down on the men in number 4 shaft, crushing them slowly, making it impossible to breathe. But silence is not the same as absence. The dead are still there. They are in the soil, scattered and forgotten. They are in the genetic memory of descendants who flinch at sudden sounds and avoid conflict without knowing why. They are in the water that still runs brown, carrying the residue of a century of extraction and the molecular traces of blood that seeped into the earth in 1927. They are in the trees that grow from ground enriched by decomposition, their roots wrapped around bones that were never properly buried. The dead are still there, and they're still waiting for someone to say their names, waiting for someone to acknowledge what was done to them and what they did to others, waiting for justice that will never come, because justice requires institutions, and the institutions failed, waiting for forgiveness that cannot be given, because forgiveness requires truth, and the truth was buried as deeply as the bodies, waiting, in the only way the dead can wait, patiently, eternally, without hope. There will be no reckoning for Black Hollow. The living do not have the courage, and the dead do not have the voice. The story will fade. In another generation, maybe two, it will be gone completely, reduced to a vague sense that something bad happened once in a place no one can quite remember the name of. The 17 will become rumor. The massacre will become myth. And myth, untethered from fact, becomes whatever people need it to be, a cautionary tale, a ghost story, a lie. This is not a story about justice. Justice never came. This is not a story about healing. There was no healing. This is not even a story about remembering, because remembering requires witnesses, and the witnesses are dying, and when they are gone, there will be no one left who knows. This is a story about what happens when we choose silence over truth, when we decide that some things are too painful to speak, too dangerous to acknowledge, too complicated to resolve. This is a story about the cost of that choice. And the cost is always the same. The dead stay dead, the living stay haunted, and nothing is ever resolved. It simply fades, like the pencil marks on the back of a photograph, until even the evidence of its existence is too faint to read. Black Hollow is still there. You can find it, if you know where to look. The creek still runs. The ruins still stand, slowly collapsing, returning to the earth that birthed them. The cemetery is still there, overgrown and forgotten. The mine entrances are still sealed, concrete monuments to a company that extracted everything of value and left nothing but poison and ghosts. If you go there, you will feel something. Everyone who has been there feels it. A heaviness, a wrongness, the sense that you're being watched, that you're not welcome, that you should leave. Some people call it haunting. Some call it intuition. Some call it superstition. But it is none of these things. It is simply the weight of untold stories, the pressure of suppressed truth, the accumulated grief of a place that witnessed horror and was never allowed to speak of it. The land holds what we will not, and it will hold it forever. 17 men died in Black Hollow in 1927. Their names were Clayton Harlan, Jesse Caudle, Thomas Harlan, Daniel Caudle, William Harlan, Robert Caudle, James Harlan, Samuel Caudle, Joseph Harlan, Matthew Caudle, Charles Harlan, Elijah Caudle, George Harlan, Nathan Caudle, Isaac Harlan, Caleb Caudle, and Henry Harlan. These are not their real names. The real names are lost or hidden or protected by descendants who will not speak. But they were real men. They lived. They worked. They loved and were loved. They had hopes and fears and dreams. And they died violently in a place that chose to forget them.